For decades, personal computing followed one predictable formula. You bought a PC, turned it on, and entered the world of Windows. It dominated offices, schools, gaming, businesses, and homes so completely that most people stopped thinking about operating systems altogether. To millions of users, Windows wasn't just software. It was the computer itself. But something has quietly changed over the last few years, and in 2026, that change is becoming impossible to ignore. Linux has crossed a line that Windows simply cannot follow anymore, and the future of operating systems may never look the same again. At first glance, that sounds impossible. Windows still ships on most laptops, most businesses still rely on Microsoft ecosystems, gamers still associate PCs with Windows, but underneath the surface, the entire technology world is moving in a different direction, and Linux is already sitting at the center of it. Look around modern computing and you'll notice something strange. The servers powering the internet mostly run Linux. Cloud infrastructure runs on Linux. AI training systems run on Linux. Supercomputers run Linux. Android phones are built on the Linux kernel. Developers rely on Linux. Cybersecurity professionals rely on Linux. Even Microsoft's own Azure cloud depends heavily on Linux infrastructure. That's the first big shift people miss. Computing is no longer centered around one desktop computer sitting under your desk. The future is cloud-connected, AI-powered, distributed, and deeply customizable. And in that environment, Linux has advantages Windows struggles to match. One of the biggest reasons is control. Modern users are starting to realize how much control they've lost over their computers. Operating systems today collect telemetry, push online accounts, display ads, force updates, integrate subscriptions, and constantly connect users to corporate ecosystems. The computer no longer feels entirely personal. It feels managed. Linux moved in the opposite direction. Instead of restricting users, Linux lets users shape the system however they want. Instead of hiding processes, it exposes them. Instead of forcing one workflow, it supports thousands of workflows. That flexibility became incredibly important once artificial intelligence exploded into mainstream computing. AI workloads demand efficiency, transparency, customization, and hardware control. Linux excels in all four. Developers can optimize every layer of the operating system, remove unnecessary background services, automate workflows, customize kernels, and run local AI models without waiting for permission from a corporation. Windows was built around the idea that the operating system itself is the product. Linux evolved into a platform users can adapt to their own needs. That difference is becoming massive as computing enters the AI era. And then there's performance. For years, people believed older computers became slow simply because hardware aged out. But Linux exposed a different reality. Many users installed lightweight Linux distributions on 10-year-old laptops and watched them suddenly feel fast again. Applications opened quicker, systems became responsive, battery life improved. Machines Windows struggled to run smoothly suddenly worked perfectly. That created a huge psychological shift. People realized their computers weren't always obsolete. Their software was becoming bloated. Linux revived old hardware, while Windows increasingly demanded newer hardware requirements, heavier background processes, and deeper ecosystem integration. In a world facing rising hardware costs and growing electronic waste, that matters more than ever. Gaming changed everything, too. For years, gaming was considered Linux's biggest weakness. Even Linux fans admitted Windows dominated gaming compatibility, but Valve completely transformed the landscape. The Steam Deck didn't just become a successful gaming handheld. It changed how millions of gamers viewed Linux itself. Suddenly, people were gaming on Linux without even realizing it. Proton compatibility improved rapidly. Thousands of games became playable. Performance gaps narrowed. Anti-cheat support improved. And most importantly, the emotional barrier around Linux gaming started disappearing. That mattered because gaming was one of the final reasons many users stayed locked into Windows. Once Linux gaming became practical, users started experimenting more seriously with Linux desktops. Some never switched back full-time. At the same time, Linux desktops themselves evolved dramatically. Older stereotypes about Linux being ugly or difficult started fading away. Modern desktop environments like KDE Plasma and GNOME became polished, fast, visually appealing, and surprisingly user-friendly. Animations improved, hardware support improved, software installation became simpler, laptop compatibility became stronger. In many cases, Linux distributions became easier to maintain than Windows systems overloaded with updates, drivers, telemetry, and background services. But Linux's biggest advantage isn't just technical, it's philosophical. Windows increasingly pushes users towards centralized ecosystems tied to Microsoft services, AI integrations, subscriptions, and cloud connectivity. Linux pushes in the opposite direction toward decentralization, modularity, and local control. That difference becomes incredibly important in the AI era. The future of computing is moving toward local AI models running directly on personal devices. People want privacy, speed, offline capability, and ownership over their own data. Linux naturally fits this future because the open-source AI ecosystem is deeply connected to Linux environments. Most AI frameworks, development tools, machine learning libraries, and server infrastructures already revolve around Linux. Developers build on Linux because it gives them unmatched flexibility. As local AI becomes more powerful, Linux gains even more momentum. Windows faces a structural problem here. Microsoft wants AI deeply integrated into its cloud ecosystem. Linux allows users to run AI privately on their own hardware without relying entirely on corporate platforms. That's not just about privacy, it's about freedom. Users are beginning to ask an important question. Should your computer belong fully to you, or should it function primarily as a gateway into someone else's ecosystem? Linux increasingly represents the first answer. Another reason Linux crossed a line Windows can't follow is speed of innovation. Open-source ecosystems evolve differently from corporations. Thousands of developers around the world experiment simultaneously. Ideas spread faster, improvements arrive continuously. Entire communities solve problems together without waiting for corporate approval. That flexibility helped Linux dominate modern developer culture. Cloud computing, containers, Kubernetes, DevOps workflows, and much of the modern internet infrastructure evolved naturally around Linux environments. Developers entering fields like AI, cybersecurity, back-end engineering, and infrastructure management almost automatically encounter Linux. Universities teach Linux, programming courses teach Linux, Raspberry Pi projects teach Linux, cloud certifications teach Linux. The next generation of developers is growing up comfortable inside Linux-based environments from the start. That creates long-term momentum. And the irony is that Microsoft itself now depends on Linux integration to stay relevant among developers. The Windows subsystem for Linux exists because developers demanded Linux tools inside Windows. Think about how unbelievable that would have sounded 20 years ago. Microsoft once treated Linux like a threat. Today, it embeds Linux directly into Windows because modern development increasingly revolves around Linux ecosystems. That alone shows how much the world changed. Transparency also plays a huge role in Linux's rise. People are becoming more aware of surveillance, data collection, algorithmic manipulation, and platform control. Open-source software offers something increasingly rare in modern technology: visibility. Communities can inspect code, audit systems, and identify problems publicly. Even users who never read a single line of code still value the idea that software can be examined openly rather than controlled entirely behind closed doors. Trust matters more than ever because operating systems increasingly handle sensitive information, AI interactions, personal communication, financial data, and creative work. Users are starting to care deeply about who controls those systems. Linux benefits from that cultural shift. And despite old stereotypes, Linux isn't just for programmers anymore. Creative tools improved dramatically. Blender became an industry-respected 3D suite. Video editing on Linux improved, music production tools matured, digital art software advanced rapidly, open-source creative ecosystems became powerful enough for serious professional work. At the same time, Linux remained lightweight, adaptable, and accessible globally. In developing regions especially, Linux offers enormous advantages because it runs well on older hardware and removes expensive licensing costs. Students, schools, repair communities, and budget-conscious users can extend the lifespan of machines that would otherwise become electronic waste. That accessibility matters because technological revolutions accelerate when tools become available to more people. Linux also thrives because it isn't controlled by one company. No single corporation can shut it down. No executive decision can erase it. Distributions evolve independently. Communities adapt. Projects fork and improve continuously. That decentralization creates resilience few commercial operating systems can match. And this leads to the most important point of all. Linux stopped being just an alternative operating system. It became foundational infrastructure for the future of computing itself. The future isn't only about desktop market share anymore. It's about where innovation happens first. Increasingly, innovation happens inside Linux ecosystems. AI development, cloud infrastructure, open source software, edge computing, local AI models, cybersecurity research, and next-generation developer workflows all lean heavily toward Linux. Windows still dominates many traditional environments, especially enterprise desktops. But dominance and direction are not the same thing. The direction of computing is changing. You can already see it happening. Gamers are getting comfortable with Linux through devices like the Steam Deck. Developers already depend heavily on Linux workflows. AI researchers build on Linux infrastructure. Students learn Linux in educational environments. Privacy-conscious users migrate toward Linux distributions. Creative professionals increasingly explore open-source tools. Linux no longer feels niche the way it once did. And once people experience that freedom, going back can feel surprisingly restrictive. Many longtime Linux users say the same thing. After adapting to Linux, Windows starts feeling heavy, intrusive, and limiting. Forced updates become frustrating. Background telemetry becomes uncomfortable. System customization feels restricted. The computer stops feeling fully personal. That emotional shift matters because operating systems are deeply tied to daily life. People spend thousands of hours inside them. Once users realize they can control nearly every aspect of their computing experience, many struggle to return to ecosystems built around centralized control. But this story isn't really about Linux replacing Windows overnight. It's about two completely different visions of the future. One future revolves around tightly managed ecosystems connected to cloud services, subscriptions, centralized AI platforms, and corporate control. The other revolves around customization, transparency, local computing, open source collaboration, and user ownership. Linux represents the second future, and in the AI era, that future suddenly feels more important than ever, because artificial intelligence will shape how people work, create, communicate, and think. The operating systems powering those experiences will matter enormously. Users will increasingly decide whether they want systems designed primarily around corporate ecosystems or systems they can fully control themselves. Linux crossed a line because it already powers the infrastructure of the future while simultaneously becoming easier for ordinary people to use. That combination is incredibly powerful. For decades, Windows defined personal computing, but the center of gravity is shifting toward openness, modularity, AI flexibility, and decentralized ecosystems. Linux sits directly at the center of all those trends. And perhaps the most remarkable part is how it happened. Linux didn't win through massive advertising campaigns or aggressive lock-in strategies. It grew through persistence, open collaboration, community-driven development, and decades of people quietly building tools they believed users deserved to control. Now the rest of the world is starting to notice. The future of operating systems is being rewritten right now, not through flashy commercials or giant product launches, but through millions of developers, creators, gamers, students, and everyday users slowly realizing they want something different from their computers. And whether people fully realize it yet or not, Linux is no longer chasing the future. It's already helping build it.